All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. We're going to have a great webinar all about what's happening in our forests by Kaitlyn, who's one of our private lands wildlife biologists. She'll be able to introduce herself and a little bit more about what she does for the Bird Conservancy in a little bit, but thank you for joining us. We do have a pretty small group this morning. Hopefully more people trickle in, but feel free to use the chat box for us to interact, so you can enter any questions that you may have. And I will relay those to Kaitlyn. We'll also have time at the end of the webinar for any questions, and we can unmute and kind of have a little conversation if we would like as well. We have the hour blocked off, and the presentation won't be that long, so we will have time for us to interact and ask any questions. I'm sure I'm going to have some questions and learn a lot from this presentation because there's a lot of stuff happening in our forest right now. So I feel like this is going to be a really relevant webinar for us today. So for us, just to start, I want to make sure that we all can use our chat function. So please type into the chat where you are, so where you're zooming from today. Hopefully it's not in outer space. Hopefully we're on Earth. But where you are today and the last really cool bird that you saw. And just feel free to enter that into the chat. You can say hi. This also helps us with attendance, so it helps us get to know our guests a little bit better, and also helps us keep track for funding purposes. So my name's Tyler. I am the Camp and Community Coordinator for the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies. So I get to run all of our overnight and day camps and teach a lot of people about birds, which is, I think, the coolest job. And I am currently in Westminster, Colorado. And the last cool bird that I saw an American three-toed woodpecker on Tuesday up in Rocky Mountain National Park. So that was actually pretty cool. So thanks, Kendall, for entering that. Tucson, Arizona. I love Tucson. I've spent a little bit of time down there. Good birds, for sure. And while you can continue to fill that in, and again, we'll interact through this chat box to begin with, but I'm going to just let us get going. So I'm going to pass it over to Kaitlyn, and she's going to present all about what's happening in our forests.
Cool. Thank you, Tyler. I am Kaitlyn Nafziger, like he said. I'm a private lands wildlife biologist, and I work for the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies, and I work in partnership with the Natural Resource Conservation Service and Colorado Parks and Wildlife. So a little bit about us real quick with the Bird Conservancy. We are made up of 3 different teams. We have stewardship, which really focuses on working with landowners and improving bird habitat and just being good stewards of the land. And we have our education team, which works to kind of get out the word about birds and what's going on, and really work to educate people of all ages about the work that we're doing and how they can get involved and help birds. And then we also have the science team, which does a lot of research about birds and really influences a lot of the work that the rest of the teams do. And it kind of helps guide some of our stewardship work and how we manage or help people manage their habitat for birds. So a quick little bit about me. Like I said, I work for the Bird Conservancy with NRCS and CPW. And I mostly work with private landowners and help them develop what we call conservation plans and forest management plans to improve their land for birds and for all wildlife in general, and just really improve the functioning of the ecosystems there. And I got into this position growing up. I grew up in the woods of southeastern Pennsylvania, and I just always loved trees. And I was working for the Bird Conservancy in New Mexico, and when I heard that this forestry-based position opened up, I jumped on it. So yeah, as you can see, I love the woods. I love all things outdoors, camping. There's my tent next to a massive redwood tree stump. So that's a little bit about me. So today I'm gonna obviously be talking to you about forestry and the woods of Colorado and birds and wildlife habitat in general a little bit. So here's the 3 kind of more common forest types that I work in. I mostly work in the southern half of the Front Range. So if any of you are familiar with Colorado and the Front Range, I'm sure you've experienced some nice Ponderosa pine trees and some aspen groves. Usually they're kind of mixed in a little bit sometimes with the Ponderosas. And then also mixed conifer, which occurs at slightly higher elevations. But today we're mostly going to focus on Ponderosa, and I'll touch a little bit on the other 2, I think, throughout. So yeah, diving right in. Ponderosa pine forest. So you guys are probably pretty familiar with these. You've seen Ponderosa pines. They're very common all kind of across Colorado and along the Front Range. Usually you find them at elevations of 6,000 to 9,000 feet. You'll find them kind of in that transition zone where you start getting up out of the grasslands into the foothills and into the Rockies. Um, and a healthy Ponderosa pine forest would be pretty open, kind of, you just feel like you're at a nice park. Kind of like this picture here, maybe just a few less trees. Um, and so these parks are really maintained by fire. That's the main ecological process that in the past historically would kind of regulate these ecosystems and keep things running smoothly and keep things in check. So in a ponderosa pine forest, you would expect to see an understory of hopefully mostly native grasses that are used to fire, and they'll bounce right back after a fire comes through. Sometimes they'll bounce back even better. The fire kind of helps reset that, and the grass that burned provides pretty good nutrients for the new stuff coming up. And then, so you'll see some grasses and forbs. You might see some Gambel's oak or some scrub oak, kind of like a little bushes. You might see some mountain mahogany. So some shrubs mixed in there too, but not too dense. And then the trees themselves, so they really evolved with fire. There used to be frequent fires on these landscapes. Some studies say in some areas anywhere from every 10 to 20 years, a pretty good fire would come through. And usually it's not very intense. It's just going to move through kind of pretty quickly and just burn the grass. And the way that the ponderosa pines have kind of evolved and learned to grow and be resilient with fire is as they grow taller, they will start to drop their branches, their lower branches. So the tree will actually just kind of seal it off so that it stops receiving water and nutrients. And then eventually the branches will just fall off. So that way, if a fire came through, it's not going to catch those bottom branches and go all the way to the top of the tree. It's just going to burn through at the base. And they also have a pretty thick layer of bark that they develop. So when that fire does come through just at the base, it's thick enough that it's going to protect them. And as long as the tree is healthy, it should be able to withstand a quick grass fire. And one other way that I like to think about it when I'm walking through a forest to kind of gauge what this historically would look like is you can kind of look at some of the trees, look for some of those bigger, older, more mature trees. Size isn't always a good way to accurately estimate an age of a tree. Some areas are going to be a little wetter and be a little more productive, so trees are going to grow bigger more quickly, so they might not necessarily be that old, but you can kind of gauge it and compare sizes of trees as you're walking and look for some of those bigger ones that might be a bit older. And then you can also look for, I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but this stump right here is what we would call a historic stump. So in the past, when people would have come in and logged these forests, you can see that they cut it a bit higher off the ground than what we would normally cut it these days, especially when they're using those hand saws and two-man saws. And then you can also see that this stump doesn't have any bark left on it, and it's actually starting to degrade and break down, which out here in our dry climates, it really does take a long time for stuff to break down. So that's another good clue. And you can kind of get a feel for how many trees used to be here in this forest and what it should look like based off of its historic conditions. So an unhealthy forest, I'm sure you guys have seen a lot of these around here since people have been settling in and expanding in the Front Range. Obviously, we don't want our houses to burn down, so we've been kind of suppressing those wildfires. So when there isn't fire on the landscape to regulate it and keep trees in check, this is a good example of what a forest would look like. It's very dense. You can see all those crowns are touching and interlocking on those trees. You can't, obviously you can't see the ground or the understory really at all. So once fire is removed, obviously more trees can start to grow. They aren't kept in check by those fires. So those ponderosas start to become pretty dense, their crowns start interlocking, and obviously it creates a lot of shade. So this is gonna shade out some of those grasses and forbs, those wildflowers that you would kind of expect to see in the understory. But then this also allows other trees like white fir and Douglas fir to start growing in. They kind of like that shade and they can tolerate it. So they'll start growing in the understory and start growing up in the forest as well. And unfortunately, these trees do not drop their lower branches, so they maintain those. So if a fire were to come through, it would catch that entire tree on fire, and the fire would just go all the way to the top, to what we call the crown. And because all those crowns are touching, it would then be able to spread to all the other trees. So unfortunately, if a fire were to come through here, you would probably lose that entire forest. Those trees would not be able to withstand it. It would just become too hot and too intense for them. Um, Also, with these dense forests and interlocking crowns, so not only does it shade out trees, but you're going to get obviously a lot of pine needles are going to be dropping. You're going to get a really thick layer of those, so that's going to smother some things as well. And then when it rains, a lot more of that rain is going to get caught up on those needles, and it's not going to be able to reach the ground. So a lot of it's going to get caught on the branches and pine needles, and it's going to eventually evaporate from there rather than going down to the ground and really infiltrating and recharging the groundwater. So it's going to reduce the amount of water available for trees as well. And because there's so many, they're really competing for that resource. So this is kind of a marginal wildlife habitat. Some things are still going to use it, and a lot of other things that prefer those open forests are unfortunately going to start to get crowded out and kind of pushed to the edges where it may still be a little bit more open, or there might be a little more light, but unfortunately it's kind of marginal. Oh, and then one more thing I forgot with this dense trees, with them all being so close, if they were to get a disease or if there was an insect outbreak, it's very easy for those insects to go from tree to tree when they're all that close. They don't have to go very far to get to the next one. So once a forest becomes like this, obviously we don't really want to burn the whole forest down. So instead, what we do to restore it, we call this work forest restoration. It can look a little overwhelming when you see this big equipment out there and you see a lot of trees coming out of the forest. But the goal of this is really to restore it to what its natural historic conditions should be. So by doing this work, we're really going to improve its ecological functions. We're going to improve wildlife habitat, and we're going to greatly reduce that wildfire risk. So what we do is we come up with a forest management plan, and we'll talk with the landowners and we'll work with them to get everybody on board. And we go out and we mark trees. And usually our goal, especially with Ponderosa pine forests, is you want to retain kind of groups and clumps of trees instead of just evenly going in and evenly thinning things out. We want to really make it look like what it should be and what it was in the past. So you're going to have some groups of maybe a couple mature trees here, and then some open space, and then another group of some younger trees. And you want to have a mix. You obviously don't want to have all just old mature trees or all young trees. You want to have a good mix to really have a healthy forest. So we go in and we mark the trees, and then we work with the loggers who come in and cut down everything that we tell them to. Which again, I know it looks a little rough in that picture, but that landscape is going to heal over and it's going to look amazing. And you can kind of see in the background behind that, you can see a few aspen trees. So sometimes you do have some aspen groves that get overgrown as well with the ponderosas and other trees moving in. So that right there, he's taking out those other trees and leaving the aspen, and they are just gonna take off. Once you open it up and they start getting more sunlight, you're going to have a bunch of little aspens popping up, and you're hopefully going to have a really good, healthy aspen stand. So once we do this work, obviously it's good for the forest, and it reduces wildfire risk, reduces the risk of insect outbreaks. It's a lot harder for those insects to move between these groups if they're spaced out more. So getting in now to the bird side of things. So when we do this work, once we open up that canopy, the understory is really going to bounce back. I think I have a picture later on towards the end where you can see some of the wildflowers that started growing back in an aspen grove that started recovering. So once we remove some of those trees and thin it out and bring in more sunlight, you're going to have those grasses and forbs and shrubs taking off. And that's really going to bring in more insects, and it's going to be great for your insectivores, for a lot of those birds who like to fly around and eat the insects. It's also going to open it up and make it a lot easier for those larger birds of prey to maneuver around and to spot their prey. So it makes it better for them as well. Also, when we do this work, we always make sure that we leave a few dead trees per acre, a few standing and a few live.
Hey, Kaitlyn, I don't know if you can hear me, but I think we lost you. If you want to turn your video off, maybe that'll help bring you back. Oh, I think we lost her completely. Well, that's okay. I'm sure she will be back. Her internet was working really well. But I'll kind of, oh, here we go.
Okay, I'll
All right,
turn
you're
off.
back.
I'm back. Sorry, I'll turn off my video. Maybe that'll help a little bit better. Okay, here we go. Okay, so yeah, it's also going to be good for your mammals. It's really going to help your deer and your elk because you're going to be really improving those grasses. Once they get sunlight, they're going to start taking off. So all of those native plants, those seeds are still there in the ground. That seedbed is still there. It's just been suppressed by shade. So once we restore it, it's pretty cool. Once you see the landscape really healing over and those grasses start coming back and you see the elk and deer coming in, they really love those young shoots. Yeah, it's great for them and turkeys. So here is a few examples if my screen will advance. It will not. Oh, there we go. Okay. So yeah, a few specific examples. Here's the Williamson sapsucker. They're a woodpecker and they like to eat insects. They also like to eat tree sap and some fruits. So like I was saying before, we always make sure that we leave some dead standing and some dead and down trees. This makes really good habitat for them. It makes it great. There's a lot of insects in those dead trees. They can also excavate nest cavities in the live trees that we leave, especially they really like aspen. So if you're at a slightly higher elevation where you do have some aspen, you can really clear it out and you can open up and release those aspen groves and they will take off. And then that leaves a lot of trees for these guys to start excavating nesting cavities in. So there's one example. Western bluebirds are another really good one. They like open meadows and they also like these open ponderosa forests, especially because they really like to feed on insects, especially in the summer. So again, by doing this work, opening it up, bringing back that understory and that habitat for those insects, you're really going to improve the habitat for bluebirds. So they also like to nest in tree cavities. They don't actually excavate their own. So sometimes if we leave some of those trees, but there aren't really many good cavities for them to nest in already, you can hang up some bluebird boxes and they love it. And they're so fun to watch. And then one last example is the northern goshawk. So like I was talking about, some of those bigger, larger birds of prey. These are typical ones that you would find in some of these forests around here. And they feed on other birds and small mammals. And they really like to nest in those large mature trees, but then they often forage in areas that have some younger trees and some regeneration where you're kind of more likely to find some of those small mammals where there's a little bit more cover for them. So in order to help them out, we always make sure that we kind of create a mosaic on the landscape. We will make sure that we have some groups and clumps of really large mature trees that are good for them to nest in, and then not too far away, we try to have some groups of some smaller, younger, more mature trees, or have a really open area where some regeneration and some new trees are really going to start shooting up and provide some good foraging habitat for them. Yeah, and then this is the one I was talking about just real quick before we go to questions. You can kind of see, unfortunately, the picture got cut off a little bit, but you can see in the bottom left corner, one dead and down tree that was left. And you can see all the wildflowers that are really starting to come back and take off there. And then on the right, you can see some young aspen shoots that are starting to take off and grow up. So that's just kind of a pretty example of what can happen after, because I know it can look a little rough when the ground gets ripped up from some of that big equipment, but it can really grow back and look amazing. So yeah, I'll open it up if you guys have any questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kaitlyn. I feel like I just learned a lot in a little bit of time, which was great. Maybe I'll get people's brains moving a little bit because I know I came up with a couple questions. So going back to Ponderosa pines, I have heard, I don't know if this is correct, but maybe you'll know a little bit more. So I've heard with Ponderosa pines that their sap can be like extremely volatile. So when a fire does come through a Ponderosa pine forested area, that sap will start heating up and it'll actually like make the bark explode, as in like come off the tree, and then it'll land on the fire to kind of help put it out. Have you ever heard that before?
I have not heard that before. I find that a little hard to believe with Ponderosa pine, mostly just because of how thick their bark is. It would have to take a pretty intense fire to really get through that and start heating it up. But one thing that did come to mind is white fir. I don't know if you've ever seen them, but especially when they're young, they have a really smooth bark, and then they get these like bubbles or these blisters. I encourage you all to go out in the woods and look for these because they're kind of fun. You just see these little bubbles sticking out, and if you just kind of squeeze them, I know it's gross, but kind of like you're popping a pimple, some of the sap will actually shoot out, and it smells amazing. And luckily, it is one that is very easy to wash off. It is not something that you will be stuck with for days or weeks. So I could maybe see it a little bit with that, but I don't think it would be enough to actually put out a fire.
Cool. Also, I don't know, I'm sure you've smelled Ponderosa pines before. I always love like smelling them. They smell like butterscotch to me.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
so I feel
Yes.
like
I
that's
highly recommend it sounds weird, but go sniff a Ponderosa pine and then pop some white fir bubbles.
good forest fun. Here comes a question in the chat from Kindle. He's saying, do the same principles apply to thick, fire-suppressed lodgepole pine forests?
Yeah, so lodgepole, I mean, we're gonna do something similar. We're still, if we can, we're gonna do a full forest restoration. Lodgepole, it kind of depends on the area too and the topography. If it's a north facing slope versus a south facing, there's been a few different studies, and most people kind of have come to the conclusion that a north facing slope is going to be a little more wet and a little more productive. But yeah, we would do a pretty similar restoration project. We're going to still take out quite a few trees and leave those groups and clumps. And then we're going to also leave a few individual ones kind of in between as well. But yeah, it's pretty similar.
Cool. And then I forgot to mention to everyone, since we are such a small group, if you have any questions and you don't feel like typing or you just want to have a conversation, feel free to unmute yourself and just ask any questions. We have some time, and I would love to kind of pick Kaitlyn's brain while we have her time with us. So feel free to unmute and ask questions. I have another question, Kaitlyn. I can go all day. I love
Go for it.
I have questions. So you're talking about when you're doing this forest restoration about marking trees, which one, the ones that you'll take down. What makes you choose certain trees over others?
That's a really good question. So I guess I'll start with, so when we go out and mark trees, some people will mark the ones that they take out, but I kind of like to mark the ones that you're going to leave because, well, first of all, you're going to save a lot of paint. You're gonna mark a lot less trees that way. And then also it's a really good visual so you can see what is going to be left behind. And when we're marking those trees, so kind of like I was talking about before, we're really going to look for, is there a big enough group of some older trees over here, or is it more smaller trees, younger trees over here? And we're going to try and leave groups of even age trees, but each group is going to be a different age, if that kind of makes sense. And typically, a lot of times in forestry, if you're marking trees for timber production, they're going to be looking for those nice, big, tall, straight trees. And a lot of times, if you see trees that are split or have curves in them, they're going to cut those down too, just because they don't want those trees to spread those genes. They want to try and manage it to be producing those really nice straight trees. But when we're doing this forest restoration, we don't really care as much about that. We're not really trying to groom this forest to, produce timber however many years down the road. And also from a wildlife standpoint, we really love those trees. If they have, if they split and they have a nice spot where a bird can put a nest in the middle and that kind of stuff, they're really good for wildlife. So we're usually going to kind of try and save some of those trees as well. So that's a little bit of how we go about marking these trees.
Cool. And kind of on that note, Maria is asking, are you mindful of nesting season when
Oh,
you ban
yes,
and remove
that's
trees?
that is a very good point that I completely forgot to mention. Yes, we do not do any work during the migratory bird nesting season. So usually I think it's March 15th to July 15th that we don't allow work to be done. If it's a very small section and it's a rare exception, we may allow a little bit of work to be done, but we're going to go out and we're going to survey first and we're going to make sure that there aren't any nests and we're not going to be impacting the birds. So yes, we do try to be very careful and minimize the impact. That way they can come and they can nest, and then hopefully when they come back next year, the habitat's just going to be even better.
Great. I have again, I can have so many questions. I love forest ecology, but I know bark beetle infestations are, of course, really bad, and even out here in Colorado, we do have a lot of bark beetles. When you are restoring a forest and you find, a lot that there's some trees that are infested by bark beetles, what like path would you take for that? I mean, would you just cut them down,
Um,
or?
That's also a really good question. So it kind of depends on what stage they're in. If they do have bark beetles, it's there for some beetles, there's some treatments that you can put on the trees, but it's very labor intensive and pretty expensive. So generally, if they already have the bark beetles, we just kind of assume, that forest is, or at least those trees that are infected are kind of already toast. So we're going to kind of continue to mark the trees as normal as we would, but we're going to be mindful of those trees that are infected and kind of keep in mind that those trees are going to be dead in a few months or years, just depending on how far along it is. So again, like I was talking about, we do like to leave some of those dead standing trees. So some of those may be ones that if we can isolate them far enough away from other trees, or if they're have already been infested and the insects have moved on and they're just slowly dying, we might leave a few of those just so we can leave them for the wildlife. Um, but yeah, it kind of just depends on how far along they are and how widespread they are.
Yeah. So on that note of, I've had a lot of debates with friends and colleagues about this. So I'm going to set a scenario for you. So
Okay.
let's say that I'm a landowner in your area, and I own a large amount of land. And let's say that I have a pretty bad bark beetle infestation. Let's say like 70% of the trees on my property are infected with bark beetle. What do you think I should do with that?
That is a very good question. So first, I'm going to talk with that landowner and ask them what their goals and objectives are for this land. Some of the landowners that we work with will run cattle, or I've had quite a few who run alpacas. So if it's something like that, that might be a good area where we just take out all those infected trees, really open it up and let it become a meadow that they can graze, and then hopefully eventually new trees will start to regrow. Also, from a wildfire perspective, a lot of people usually come to us because they want to do wildfire mitigation. And that might be one where, unfortunately, we're just going to have to clear out the majority of those trees because they're already infected. And if we leave them there, from what I've heard from some studies, your house is more likely to catch on fire actually if there is from an entire tree or an entire log versus what we call mastication or masticated trees. So sometimes some of the trees that we take out, we're going to take them out whole and they will actually go on to become timber or pallets, or some of it gets chipped for actually they make Scott's Miracle Grow out of it. And then other ones, we're still going to leave some, but we can't leave a ton. And then we also have a lot of those branches that we have to deal with. So they will actually masticate some of that, and they just kind of shred it up pretty fine so that it can decompose a little quicker and spread it out a little bit. So if you do have a lot of those dead standing trees or soon to be dead trees, and your house is nearby, we are probably also going to want to take out a lot of those trees, because if they are left whole close to structures, um, more sparks actually come off of whole trees than the masticated chipped wood, which I would have thought the other way around, but that's what the studies have been showing. So that is a pretty big risk, fire risk for your house as well.
Cool, thanks. I love asking these kind of questions. But if anyone else has any questions, I feel like there should be. If they don't come up, I can have questions, kind of about the fires that we had in Colorado last year, and even I mean in California, the whole West was basically on fire last summer. And I know
Yeah.
like fire suppression is a kind of a leading cause of that. Um, what if okay? Let's say that we love talking about funding because we work for a nonprofit. Let's say that you had all of the funding in the world from this like
Mm.
angel investor, and if you and made to kind of mitigate and stop fires in the West, what would be like your number one concern with like, let's say you have this huge project, like you're literally gonna do forest restoration on the whole Western forests. What do you think is like kind of the most important part of to make sure that we don't have these very large, intense hot fires?
Mm. So yeah, I think I would try to find as many landowners as I could who are on board with the full restoration process that I described. Some people really don't like the amount of trees that we try to have them take out, and so they do what we call just a thinning, or a thinning from below, where they'll take out a few trees, kind of leave some evenly spaced trees, and then also take off some of those lower branches that might not have dropped yet. So I would try to focus more on convincing people to do the full forest restoration, because that's really going to give you the most bang for your buck, and it's going to be the best for wildlife. It's going to be the best for wildfire mitigation. So I think the first thing I do would be to try and find as many landowners with as much land as I could who are willing to do that kind of work. And then the second thing, one of the biggest challenges that we face is trying to figure out what to do with all of that wood that comes off of the property. I know most people kind of think that, you're cutting down these trees and they're going to go and they're going to be made into timber, especially because we have this big timber shortage. But unfortunately, in Colorado, there was a pretty big drop off of logging, and the timber industry is just not really hasn't really caught up to the work that we are doing yet. So I would also try to find some people to maybe start setting up some timber mills so we can start processing and actually using this wood for all of this wood that's coming off for good purposes. But yeah, I think I would mainly focus on maybe some areas along the Front Range where there are more structures at risk, and then try and find some areas that would be really great to target for wildlife. And yeah, those I think are my two kind of big main objectives whenever I get funding for a project.
Yeah, awesome. I had a feeling that this question was going to bring up some more questions from people because I feel like fire was such a big aspect of the news. Kind of in the last, I mean, I would say like the last 5 years. I grew up in California and we had wildfires all the time. Instead of having
Yeah.
snow days, we had like fire days because there was too much ash. So we'd have like
Wow.
school canceled because ash in the skies. But we have a question from Kindle. He's saying that, so the areas that burned last summer, those large fires that we had, how can we
Mhm.
keep them from getting overgrown again? And then what's the normal fire frequency and can we actually allow that?
So it kind of just depends on the landscape and the area and how many homes and structures there are. But really, it seems like the best way to do it, especially if a forest has already gotten to that stage where it's so overgrown, you really don't want a fire to go through there at those current conditions, because it's just going to become so hot and intense that it's going to be really hard to keep under control. So the best way to treat it once they have already reached that stage where they're so dense is to really do the work that we do, the forest restoration, to go in and just manually cut down these trees. And when we do these projects and we're laying it out and we're marking these trees, I really try to keep in mind, the work that we're doing today is should hopefully last for the next 50 to 100 years. So we're hoping that we can go in and really treat these forests a little heavily, but set them up to regenerate, and to hopefully not have to be treated, or at least not be heavily uh, have to be heavily treated for the next like 50 to 100 years. And then just kind of, it's usually easier once it's been treated that way to maintain it, where you can kind of keep an eye on it. And if you do get some areas where you have a lot of spruce or fir or a lot of dense saplings coming up, kind of keep an eye on it. You know, they're going to compete and some are going to die out naturally. And then you may need to go out with some, if you can do it while they're still young, some clippers and just kind of clip them every so often to keep it from getting to that way again. And if people are on board and they would, if they have already gotten it to a safer level, a lower density, if people are on board and they don't have homes or structures too close and are willing to burn it, that would be great. We can work with people, we can work with the state, and we can work with them to get set up for a controlled burn. But the normal, from what I've seen and from what I've read, it seems like the normal fire regime for most areas in Ponderosa pine was anywhere from 10 to 20 years. You would have a low intensity fire come through. And again, when the forest has been treated and it's in those good, healthy conditions, that fire is just going to burn through quickly on the ground. It's just going to burn up the grass and those trees are going to be fine. And you're not going to lose your entire forest. That's always our goal.
Yeah, that was a great explanation of that. Thanks, Kaitlyn. And I just have one more question, and if no more pop up, we'll let you enjoy the rest of your day. But talking about control burns, I know kind of a lot of people bring up, that if we just do more controlled burns in certain areas, we would have healthier forests. And I've listened, I've read documents and listened to podcasts about controlled burns, and it's actually really hard to do controlled burns because you have to have the perfect conditions for them, and that doesn't happen as often as we would like.
Yeah.
I guess I might have just answered my question, but I was trying to frame it without answering it. But how do you see, let's just say the Colorado Forest Service, do you see us putting more government money towards controlled burns or more government money towards just forest restoration?
I think at this point, putting more money towards forest restoration, I think is kind of the way we need to go. Just there's so many really dense, unhealthy forests right now. I think that should be the main focus, getting them down to a level where we could do a safe controlled burn. I also come from the East Coast, and in one of my previous jobs, I did a lot of work with controlled burns. I did a lot of measuring and laying out fire breaks. And so that's kind of what I'm used to. And then coming out here, and so many people are just so afraid of fire. But after last year's massive wildfires, I mean, I can see why. And it is pretty hard. We really need those good conditions. We really need a nice day. It can't be very windy. And yeah, it's hard to come by. It's the window for safe controlled burns is pretty small out here, it seems like. So I think full restoration definitely needs to at least happen first, so we can get it to a point where maybe we can use those controlled burns later to continue to maintain it.
I can see kind of controlled burns being in a restoration plan, along the way. They kind of can go hand in hand. In a management plan. All right, so we have a couple more questions, and then I'm done asking questions. So we'll have a couple more questions, and then we'll end this webinar. But let's get these answered. So Maria's wondering, is the Forest Service responsible for maintaining the land in national parks?
So if it's a national park, that is actually the National Park Service. They are technically under two departments. The Forest Service is under the USDA, the Department of Agriculture, which the organization that I work with, the NRCS, is also under the same one. So if it's a national forest, that's their territory. That's going to be the National Forest Service and USDA. And then the National Park Service is actually under, I am drawing a blank all of a sudden.
Department of the Interior, right?
Yes, that's it. Thank you. They're under the Department of Interior, and it's a separate department, so it's on them. I think they can work together some, and I know obviously if there are big wildfires, they're going to call in anybody who can help with that. But when it comes to actually doing the work, it kind of falls to that department. Now, that being said, we are starting to get more funding. We have a fund pool. It's called the Joint Chiefs. So it's an agreement between the chief of the Forest Service and the Natural Resource Conservation Service, and they actually have come together pull some funding from each and kind of put it together. And we work together to treat and do these forest restoration projects. So we can treat private land and some bordering national forests kind of all together. I mean, both agencies will work together to create the plan, but then we may hire one logger who will come in and treat uh, both sides or both land use types.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for that clarification. There's so much more that goes into kind of national parks and national forests, and kind of if you don't research who's handling these things in the government, it can get a little confusing.
Yeah, it's pretty complicated.
Yeah. So here come some more questions. So Kendall's wondering, how do we balance the need for more trees for carbon? Sorry, my thing's being all weird. For carbon uptake with the need to keep forests more open and natural. Where, if anywhere, can we plant more trees? And does aspen recovery help without increasing fire danger?
Yeah, that is also a really good question. I would say plant trees on the East Coast and the West Coast, maybe in areas that typically do get more moisture and would have those more dense forests. But you know, trees really are, they're not the only thing that's sequestering carbon. These grasses and forbs and wildflowers that are growing, they're also still pulling carbon, and they're pulling it and they're putting it in the soil. So the soil is also a really good carbon bank. Um, so, and like I said, you know, these trees that we cut down, we're not just cutting them all down for firewood and burning them. We're finding other uses for them. A lot of them gets mulched so that some of that carbon is still going to be maintained that was already pulled from the atmosphere. It's still going to be maintained. Some of it's going to get mulched and go back into the ground. But yeah, I would say maybe if you can plant a few trees spaced out a safe distance from your house and more in areas that really get more rain and would naturally have those trees. And also aspen, that is a good example. Once we release those aspen groves and they take off, as long as they are kind of a safe distance away from your house or a structure, that's another safe way to really get more trees to sequester carbon.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I feel like our forests don't need more trees. Like our suburban areas or like
Yes.
cities need more trees. And I feel like that would really help with carbon sequestration too. Awesome. Thank you so much, Kaitlyn, for that. I know you have one more slide, and then I'll wrap it all up for us.
Oh yeah. So I just want to say a quick thank you to everybody who joined on today. Thank you so much for being interested in this topic and for listening and asking those really great questions. So just on behalf of the Bird Conservancy, I wanted to say thank you. And yeah, if you're interested in learning more about us and the Bird Conservancy in general, you can go to our website, or you can just Google Bird Conservancy of the Rockies, and we would love to chat with you guys if you have more questions too.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you all so much for joining. Thank you so much, Kaitlyn, for your time and putting this all together. This is just another great example of how we at Bird Conservancy, how we conquer and how we establish our mission of conserving birds and their habitats, and by working together with stewardship, education, and science. And with all of us working together, we'll hopefully be able to help actually conserve birds and these habitats that they live in, because if they don't have their habitat, we cannot conserve the birds in general. So that's why we have such a great private land wildlife biologist and stewardship program. But again, I'm going to be sending out a thank you email probably right after this. I'm going to upload this webinar to our YouTube channel. Feel free to share that link with any of your friends or colleagues or anyone that you know that will be interested to listen to this conversation and this presentation as well. And next month, we will continue our monthly webinar series. We have them throughout the year. And next month, we will have Delaney, who's our Nebraska Wildlife Education Coordinator. And she's going to be presenting on basically bird and their bird senses. So like their eyesight, how they differ from humans. So it should be a kind of an interesting bird biology webinar. So look out on our website or our Facebook page for the registration for that. We should have that open in the next couple of weeks. So again, thank you so much, Kaitlyn, and thank you everyone that has joined us this morning for this webinar. Hope you take some of this information, and hopefully we don't have as bad of fires this year. And if we do, hopefully they're the low burning and the good kind that we need, and not these huge fires. So thank you so much, Kaitlyn. I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend and a great summer. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you guys.